They said there wasn't enough room at the table, so I built my own. While my parents celebrated without me, I opened my Aspen lodge to 200 strangers and turned loneliness into light. The next morning, the photos were everywhere. The same people who shut me out were suddenly begging to be part of my story. They wanted forgiveness. What they got was the truth. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe /like button and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. The snow had already started to fall by the time I woke up. Thin white flakes drifted past the kitchen window, clinging to the edge of the glass, like they were afraid to land. The radio murmured in the background. Have yourself a merry little Christmas. Soft, nostalgic, too tender for the way my chest felt that morning. I poured coffee into a mug, wrapped both hands around it, and stood still long enough for the steam to fade. On the counter, the wrapping paper waited. Gold foil, silver ribbons, small tags I'd written out the night before. To Mom, to Dad, to Grace's kids. The handwriting was neat, careful, the kind that tried to make up for something it couldn't say. I hesitated before writing my own name on the last tag, then I left it blank. I told myself I'd mail the gifts later. Pretend everything was normal. Pretend the silence was just distance, not disinterest. My phone buzzed before I could finish the thought. One new message. Christmas is just family this year. Maybe next time. 8 words, no emojis, no heart, no explanation, just the familiar chill hidden behind politeness. I stared at the screen until the coffee lost its heat. I could almost hear his voice, measured, rational, like he was giving a weather report instead of cutting me out. The snow outside thickened, falling slower now, heavy flakes drifting like ash. I set the mug down, my hand trembling slightly, though I told myself it was the cold. No one was there to see my face. Maybe that was the point. I'd learned how to take these messages like a professional, quietly, politely, like they didn't sting. I opened the text again, reread it once more, as if a second read might reveal a hidden kindness I'd missed the first time. It didn't. I typed 2 words. No worries. Then I hit send. The tiny whoosh of the message leaving my phone felt like a final breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I set it face down on the counter. For a moment, I let the silence fill the apartment. The hum of the heater, the faint whistle of wind through the old windows, the song on the radio moving into another verse. 35 years old, and still waiting for permission to be part of something I'd been born into. I smiled without meaning, to that tight kind of smile you give a stranger who bumps into you on the street. No worries. The perfect lie. The city outside looked gray, like the color had drained out overnight. Cars crawled along the streets below, headlights dim in the snow. I wondered who counted as family this year. Grace, of course. Her husband, their kids. Maybe Mom's sister. Probably a few of Grace's friends. She had a talent for collecting admirers. And me, I wasn't even sure they remembered I lived just 2 states away. I walked to the window, pressed my fingers against the cold glass. Denver's skyline blurred through the snow, soft and unreachable. I whispered mostly to myself, it's fine, but even my own voice didn't sound convinced. The smell of coffee lingered in the kitchen. I took a sip, lukewarm now bitter, and tried to focus on the little things, the twinkle lights along the windowsill, the half-wrapped gifts, the sound of the song changing again. I wanted to believe the day could still feel like Christmas, even if no one said my name. A flash of memory flickered, the kind that arrives without invitation. I was 7, standing in the living room of our old house in Portland. Grace was 10 front and center, in a red velvet dress. The Christmas tree glowing behind her. Mom kept saying, "Smile. Everyone closer." Dad adjusted the camera, and I held the Polaroid film box for him, waiting for my turn. But when the shutter clicked, I realized I wasn't in the frame. "Take one more with me in it," I'd asked. Dad laughed, distracted. "We'll get you in the next one, honey." The next one never came. That photo ended up in every holiday album. The perfect family mom. Dad, Grace. I was the one holding the camera, cropped out by kindness. Back in the present, I blinked, the memory dissolving like the snow outside. My apartment felt too quiet, the kind of quiet that made you aware of your own breathing. I picked up my phone again, half expecting another text, a follow-up. Something like, "We'll see if we can make space," or "Drop by for dessert." But nothing. The lock screen stared back at me, empty and still. For a second, I almost called, just to say Merry Christmas, just to remind them I existed. But then I remembered how those calls usually went: polite small talk, a few awkward pauses, and the soft sigh of relief when we hung up. It wasn't malice. It was habit, and habit could be crueler than hate. I leaned against the counter looking at the gifts. Maybe I'd still send them. Or maybe I'd leave them there, let the ribbons gather dust until the season passed. The snow outside thickened, turning the city into a blur of white and silver. Somewhere in Portland, my family was probably hanging ornaments, arguing over desserts, laughing the way they always did, loudly, completely without noticing who wasn't there. I exhaled slowly, the air fogging the window. No worries, I said again, softer this time, and this time it almost sounded true. I set the mug in the sink, turned off the radio, and stood for a moment listening to the quiet hum of the city, waking up below. Some endings don't need words, I thought. They just happen while you're looking the other way. Outside, the snow kept falling steady and soundless, and for a while I just stood there watching it. Portland smelled like wet pine and cinnamon that winter. I remember stepping out of the cab in front of my parents' house, snow melting against the curb. My fingers stiff around the warm pie tin I'd carried all the way from Seattle. I'd spent half the night baking it, pumpkin, my first one from scratch. I'd imagined the smell filling our kitchen. Mom smiling, Dad saying something simple like, "That looks amazing." When I walked in, the house was loud. Bing Crosby's voice drifted from the stereo, the smell of roasted turkey and buttered rolls wrapping around me like nostalgia I hadn't earned. Grace was already at the dining table, her hair shiny, her smile polished exactly the way Mom liked to photograph her. Dad was pouring red wine into crystal glasses, laughing at something Grace's fiancé had said. Mom turned from the oven, her face brightening when she saw me. "Oh, sweetheart, you made it," she said. Then her eyes dropped to the pie in my hands. "That looks nice. Maybe set it on the side table, honey. The main table's a little tight this year." The words hit softly coated in sugar, but they still stung. The main table was long, room for 8, maybe 9 if they squeezed. The side table sat off to the corner next to the window where the cold seeped through. I looked at it, metal legs uneven on the floor. My seat. It always was. "Sure," I said, setting the pie down. I smiled like it didn't matter. Grace looked up, waved a fork at me. "You're just in time. We were talking about my new job at Horizon Marketing. I start next week. They said I'll be in charge of 3 accounts. Mom clapped her hands, her bracelets jingling. "Oh, Grace, that's wonderful." Dad raised his glass. "See, hard work pays off." I stood a few steps away, still holding my coat, waiting for someone to ask about me. No one did. I hung the coat myself and took the empty chair at the end of the small side table. The metal felt cold through my jeans. From where I sat, the main table looked like a stage. Everyone lit perfectly, laughter bouncing between them. My plate was a little smaller, my fork mismatched. It made me laugh quietly to myself. Of course it was. Dad finally noticed me. "How's school?" Still doing computer stuff." "Yeah," I said, grateful for the question. "Actually, I just got accepted into the advanced coding program at the university. It's pretty competitive, only 12 spots." He nodded, distracted already, looking back toward Grace. "That's nice. But are you sure that's what you want? Tech's unstable?" "Not really. Secure for women, is it?" I blinked. "It's where everything's heading, Dad. Logistics business, all of it." He smiled the way people do when they don't plan to listen. "Maybe. Still safer to pick something practical. You're smart enough to go into teaching or accounting. Something steady." Grace laughed softly. "You'd be great at teaching, Em. You've always liked explaining things." I wanted to say I don't want to explain things. I want to build them. But I didn't. Instead, I picked up my fork and cut a piece of turkey that tasted like cardboard. The conversation rolled on without me. Grace's boss. Grace's new apartment, Grace's wedding plans. Every few minutes, Mom looked my way and smiled like she'd remembered I existed. "You okay over there, sweetheart?" she asked once. "Perfect," I said. She nodded, satisfied, and turned back to refill Grace's glass. The laughter from the main table was steady, rhythmic, the sound of belonging. I focused on the small noises instead, the scrape of my fork on the plate, the uneven creak of my chair, the faint whistle of wind pressing against the window beside me. The smell of my pie reached me rich and sweet, cooling on the sideboard untouched. Halfway through dinner, Mom rose to serve dessert. We have Grace's favorite, pecan, and that little one Emily made. Maybe we'll let Aunt Margaret try it first just to be safe. Everyone laughed gently. It wasn't cruel, but it landed somewhere deep anyway. I laughed too. That's what you do when your place in the family depends on keeping things easy. Dad carved another slice of turkey talking about Grace's leadership skills. "That girl's got vision," he said proudly. He didn't mean to sound comparative, but he always did. I kept eating quietly. In my head, I built something that had no room for tables like this one. I imagined circuits code a system that didn't care whose daughter you were. Machines were fair in ways people weren't. After dessert, Grace's fiancé offered to take family photos by the fireplace. Everyone gathered. I stood waiting for someone to call my name. No one did. The flash went off, capturing the perfect picture, Mom's hand on Grace's shoulder, Dad beaming beside them. I stood off to the side, holding my coffee. "Let's get one more," Mom said, adjusting her sweater. "Maybe we'll fit Em in this time." Everyone laughed again, softer this time, maybe even kindly. But it was already done. The photo would live in the album, and I'd still be cropped out by distance. When the evening ended, I helped clear plates while Grace and Mom chatted about seating charts for the wedding. The sink steamed with hot water. I washed quietly, stacking dishes into neat rows. The clatter of plates was steady, almost calming. Behind me, the sound of wrapping paper and laughter continued in the living room. Dad passed by holding his wine glass. "You did good, Em," he said absently. "That pie smelled great." "Thanks," I said, but he was already gone. I dried my hands, turned off the kitchen light, and looked around one last time. The tree sparkled, the fire burned low, and from my little corner table, the half-eaten pie sat alone, under the glow of the overhead light. I thought not sadly, but simply, I was invited, yes, but only close enough to prove I still knew my place. Seattle was always gray. The kind of gray that got under your skin. Rain sliding down the windows, streetlights reflecting off puddles that never dried. I rented a studio above a laundromat that smelled like detergent and damp socks. The ceiling leaked when it rained too hard, and it always rained too hard. But it was mine, my own space, my first space. After graduation, I got a job at a small cold chain logistics startup, barely more than 4 desks and a coffee pot that coughed more than it brewed. I spent 12 hours a day mapping delivery routes for frozen food shipments, typing code until my wrists ached. At night, I heated instant noodles on a hot plate, ate over my keyboard, then fell asleep on the same couch I worked on. The city outside buzzed, but all I heard was the hum of my old laptop fan. Every few weeks I emailed my parents, updates about work, a few photos lines about how excited I was to be learning. The replies always came quickly, polite, and predictable. "We're proud of you. Grace just got promoted," or "So glad you're doing well. Grace's team might open a new branch." It was almost funny how efficient they were at fitting me between her successes. I learned to measure my worth by their punctuation, their 3 empty words wedged between someone else's applause. Sometimes I imagined what it would be like if they asked about me, just once. Not what I was doing, but how I was doing. But imagination didn't pay rent, and rent was due. By late 2013, the company I worked for started missing paychecks. The founders promised it was temporary, but you could feel the desperation in every meeting. The way they smiled too big, talked too fast. When the last check bounced, everyone packed their things. I stayed until the lights shut off. I remember sitting there, surrounded by empty cubicles, rain streaking down the glass. That's when it hit me. I'd been waiting my whole life for someone else to open a door that wasn't built for me. So I started building my own. I bought a whiteboard off Craigslist, carried it 6 blocks in the rain, and set it up in my apartment. On it, I drew a rough map of what would become MedChain Logistics, a predictive tracking platform for refrigerated deliveries, medicine, food, vaccines, anything that couldn't afford to arrive late. I wasn't trying to be a visionary. I was just tired of watching good ideas rot in storage because no one cared enough to see them through. The laptop wheezed like an old man, but it worked. Mateo, a Cuban-American engineer I'd met at a previous internship, agreed to help. June, a data analyst who'd been laid off with me, joined a week later. The 3 of us set up in the back of an abandoned garage behind a diner. The landlord gave us a discount because he didn't think we'd last the month. We lived on diner coffee and leftover pie coating until sunrise. Mateo slept in his car. June crashed on my floor. I remember one night the power went out mid-compile, and all 3 of us just sat in the dark laughing because it was either that or cry. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. Every failure, every tiny win, it all belonged to us. When the system finally ran a full simulation without crashing, I stayed up all night watching the lines on the screen move like veins, data pulsing alive. It was ugly, glitchy, and beautiful. I snapped a photo of it and sent it to my parents. Built something tonight, I wrote. The reply came the next morning. That's great. Grace just got promoted to regional director. I laughed so hard it scared the downstairs neighbor's cat. It wasn't bitterness, not anymore. It was clarity. They would never see me unless the world forced them to. So I decided to make something impossible to ignore. By 2015, MedChain had its first real client, a regional grocery distributor losing thousands a month to spoiled produce. We worked non-stop for 72 hours coding fixes and tracking sensors in real time. When the pilot ended, not a single shipment failed. It wasn't a miracle, just math and persistence. But the client called it revolutionary. That night, I walked home through the drizzle shoes, soaked heart-pounding. I wanted to tell someone. I almost called my mom, thumb hovering over her name. But then I thought of the last conversation we'd had, her voice soft, half-listening, telling me how proud she was that Grace's company made the holiday ad campaign that year. I lowered the phone, slipped it back into my pocket. Instead, I went home, poured myself a cheap glass of wine, and sat on the floor. Between cables and empty takeout boxes, the whiteboard still had our scribbles on it, crossed-out ideas, half-erased formulas, tiny victories in dry erase ink. The sound of rain on the roof was steady, almost rhythmic. I opened my laptop, stared at the MedChain logo blinking on the screen, and whispered to no one. We did it. Later that week, I called my father anyway. I don't know why. Habit, maybe. He picked up on the second ring. Dad, I said, trying to sound casual, I just registered my company, MedChain Logistics. It's official. There was a pause. Papers rustled on his end, the faint click of a pen. MedChain, he repeated. What kind of business is that cold chain logistics? Predictive data routing. We already have one client and... That sounds risky, he interrupted. Just be careful, Emily. You know your mother worries. And don't expect anyone to bail you out if it collapses. The line went quiet after that. I waited for something more, anything. Good luck, congratulations, even curiosity. But all I heard was the soft hum of his office air conditioner before he said, Well, I've got to run. Proud of you, though, and hung up. I stared at the phone until the screen dimmed. The word proud didn't mean much when it arrived out of habit. I leaned back against the wall, closed my eyes, and let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I didn't need them to save me. I didn't even need them to understand. I just wanted them to see. Outside, the rain kept falling soft and endless, washing the city clean of everything except the sound of its own heartbeat. The pen felt heavier than it should have. One signature, that's all it took. 2 loops of ink on the page, and 8 years of sleepless nights were suddenly worth $120 million. The room around me erupted in applause, champagne corks, flying laughter echoing off the glass walls of the downtown Denver office. My team hugged, shouted, snapped photos. I smiled for them, but my body stayed still. My hands flat on the polished table. Outside snow fell slow and steady, each flake dissolving against the window. I turned toward it away from the camera flashes. 8 years ago I'd started MedChain with an old laptop and a folding chair. Now I was standing 40 stories above the city, watching everything I'd built get swallowed by the clouds. Emily say something for the group photo June called, holding her glass high. You're the reason we're here. I turned back, raised my glass, forced a grin. To all of us, I said, to never giving up. My voice sounded normal, confident, exactly what everyone needed it to be. They cheered again, and for a few minutes, I let myself believe it, that this was what success felt like. But when the lights dimmed and people drifted toward the bar, the noise faded to a low hum. My phone buzzed on the table beside the contract. A text from Mom. We're so happy for you, Grace. Just got invited to a national marketing conference. Such an exciting week for the family. I stared at it until the words blurred. Happy for you had never sounded so hollow. I put the phone face down, leaned back in my chair, and laughed under my breath. Not bitter, just tired. Later that month, the invitation arrived, a speaking slot at the Women in Leadership Summit in San Francisco. We'd love to feature you, the organizer said on the call. Your story's inspiring. I thanked her and accepted, even though part of me already knew how it would go. I bought 3 first-class tickets anyway, addressed to Mom, Dad, and Grace. I printed the itinerary. Wrote a note in my neatest handwriting. It would mean a lot if you came. The reply came a week later in my father's concise style. We'd rather not. We don't want attention. You understand? 4 sentences that closed a door as quietly as it had ever been opened. On the day of the conference, the ballroom shimmered with gold light, cameras flashing as women in tailored suits took their seats. My name flashed on the big screen. Emily Carter, CEO, MedChain Logistics. The host smiled, her voice bright. Our next speaker turned innovation into impact. Please welcome Emily Carter. The applause was warm, polite, practiced. I stepped up to the podium, looked out over the audience. The first row glowed under the lights. Every seat filled except 2 in the middle, side by side, marked with small reserved signs. Air and Mrs. Carter. I'd left them there on purpose. The speech went fine. I said all the right things about perseverance leadership, the power of believing in yourself when no one else does. People clapped at the right moments. A woman in the second row even cried. But when I looked at those 2 empty chairs, the words started to sound like noise. I wondered if anyone else could tell that the person talking about courage still felt like the girl sitting at the side table, waiting to be seen. After the panel, I smiled through interviews, shook hands, posed for photos. The conference director handed me a bouquet of white roses. Your parents must be so proud, she said. I smiled again, the same reflex I'd perfected years ago. I think they are. I lied. That night, back in my hotel room, I set the roses in the sink and turned off the lights. The city below pulsed with movement, cars streaking through the fog, neon signs blinking. I sat by the window hills, kicked off, and pulled up my father's message again. The words glowed blue against the dark. We'd rather not. We don't want attention. I read it 3 times slower each time, as if understanding it differently might make it hurt less. It didn't. Outside, the fog rolled in thick from the bay, swallowing the tops of buildings until they vanished. The room felt too quiet, too clean, too lonely. I deleted the message, but the silence stayed. I tried calling Grace, straight to voicemail. I imagined her laughing somewhere, probably telling someone how crazy her little sister was. Tech genius never comes home, probably too busy for family. Maybe she was right. Maybe I'd chosen this distance. I changed into jeans, grabbed my coat, and walked out into the San Francisco night. The air was sharp sea salt mixed with rain. I walked without direction down Market Street, past the glass towers, and the street musicians playing Christmas songs out of season. My reflection followed me in every window. Successful, well-dressed, alone. At a crosswalk, the light turned red, and I stopped beside a woman holding her daughter's hand. The little girl was eating cotton candy, laughing, blue sugar smeared across her cheek. The mother smiled at her, tired but content. Something in my chest cracked open a space I didn't know was still empty. I whispered to myself, "You wanted to be seen, not worshipped. Just seen." Back in the hotel, I poured a drink, sat on the edge of the bed, and watched the snow start to fall through the window. It almost never snowed in San Francisco. But that night, tiny, white flecks drifted down, catching the city lights like glitter. I raised the glass, looked at the reflection of myself in the dark window. Older, steadier, unrecognizable to the girl who once begged for a seat at the main table. "I'll make my own noise," I said quietly. "And this time they'll hear it." The snow kept falling, dissolving as it hit the glass, leaving faint traces that faded before they could freeze. The drive to Aspen felt endless. 4 hours from Denver through winding mountain roads, the kind where the sky presses low and the world turns white. The GPS signal kept dropping, and the snow fell in thick, heavy curtains that blurred everything except the road ahead. When I finally saw it, a dark silhouette tucked between pine trees and ridges. I slowed the car to a crawl. The old lodge stood there like a relic from another century. 2 stories of weathered cedar shutters hanging loose, a rusted sign that read, "White Creek Lodge." I turned off the engine. For a moment, all I heard was wind. Cold air hit my face when I opened the door sharp enough to sting. My boots crunched on the snow. The building looked like it had been forgotten by everyone but the mountains themselves. I walked up the steps, touched the warped wood railing. It gave slightly under my hand. "Looks like home," I said aloud, and the words came out half laugh, half breath. The real estate agent had called it a fixer-upper with potential. He didn't mention that half the windows were cracked, or that the main hall smelled faintly of smoke and pine sap. Inside, the floorboards creaked like the house was exhaling after being empty too long. Dust motes floated in the sunlight coming through the high windows, thick and golden. I traced my fingers over the old reception desk, the grain rough beneath my gloves. The next morning, I hired a crew of local carpenters, 4 men who looked at me like I was out of my mind. "You're gonna need a lot more than paint, ma'am," one of them said, half amused. I smiled. "Then let's start with paint." For the next few weeks, the lodge echoed with sound again. Saws cutting through warped planks, hammers striking nails, the low hum of a generator. I joined in where I could. I scrubbed floors until my hands ached. Sanded window frames painted over the years of neglect, one stroke at a time. The scent of cedar filled the halls again. At night, I'd sit by the small fireplace, notebook in hand, sketching plans for how to turn the empty dining hall into something alive. The nearest neighbor, Tom Parker, stopped by one afternoon with a pickup bed full of firewood and a sack of potatoes. He was in his 40s, tall, with a voice that carried warmth like a good hearth. "Heard someone bought the old White Creek," he said, setting the wood down by the porch. "Didn't believe it till now. I like lost causes." I said. He laughed. "That's what they all say before the first snowstorm breaks a window." We sat on the porch, drinking coffee from chipped mugs, while the sun dipped behind the peaks. He told me he'd grown up here, that his father used to help host something called the Open Christmas Dinner. Back in the 90s, this town had a tradition, he said, leaning back. Every Christmas Eve, folks who didn't have anywhere to go would come to the lodge. No reservations, no charge. Just food, music, and company. "What happened?" I asked. "People stopped coming," he said simply. Then one year nobody showed up at all. The owner closed it down. Never reopened. I looked out over the snowfields stretching from the porch to the tree line. The wind had carved smooth curves into it like waves frozen mid-tide. "Do you ever miss it?" Tom took a sip, shrugged. "Sure, but that's the thing about good traditions. They only last if someone keeps them alive." That night, after he left, I walked through the lodge alone. The rooms smelled of fresh paint and old memories. Upstairs, the hallways still creaked, but the sound no longer felt lonely. I ran my hand along the banister, newly polished, and paused at the top of the stairs. I could almost see it. The tables stretching from wall to wall, lights strung across the rafters, candles flickering against the windows. People laughing, eating, the air filled with warmth and music instead of dust. The image hit me so vividly that, for a second, I could smell the roast and hear the clinking of glasses. I stood in the center of the great hall where the wooden beams met above like an old cathedral and whispered, "If they close their doors, I'll open mine." It wasn't a plan, not yet. Just a promise hanging in the cold air. The next morning, the crew finished the last of the repairs. When they left, I stayed behind, walking from room to room with a rag and a bucket, cleaning the smudges they'd left. I replaced the light bulbs one by one until the place glowed again. When the sun began to set, I stepped outside. The sky burned orange and pink, the snow shimmering like crushed glass. The mountains around me were silent except for the wind sweeping through the trees. I leaned against the new door I'd painted red, the color of warmth, and let my hand rest on the smooth wood. The air smelled of pine and something else, possibility. I looked up at the wide, endless stretch of sky, and thought maybe this was what freedom sounded like. Not applause, not validation, but the steady hush of snow falling on a home you built for yourself. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was waiting to be seen. I was exactly where I wanted to be. I locked the door, turned off the lights, and stood in the silence long enough to hear my own heartbeat. Then I smiled and whispered, "Welcome back." The snow had turned the valley silver by the time I made the first call. It was December 20th, 4 days before Christmas Eve, and the sky hung low and gray, the kind of cold that made breath look like smoke. I stood on the porch of the lodge with my phone pressed to my ear, watching flakes drift past the string lights I'd hung along the beams. "Sheriff Collins." A deep voice answered. "David, it's Emily Carter." There was a pause, then a chuckle. "The famous tech millionaire who bought half my town. What can I do for you?" "I need your help," I said. "I'm planning a Christmas dinner. For anyone who doesn't have a place to go. How many people are we talking about?" I looked out at the snow-covered field, the way the wind carved small ridges along the drifts. 200, maybe more. "I've got space heat in a kitchen." He laughed low. That's not dinner, that's an operation. You sure you're ready for that? I've been ready for a long time. Well, he said finally, I'll start calling around. Shelters, the VA, maybe the food pantry. You'll have more guests than you know what to do with Carter. That's the point, I said. When we hung up, I could still hear the faint smile in his voice. By the next morning, word had already spread through town. Trucks passed by to drop off donations, sacks of flour, boxes of potatoes, jars of jam. Someone left a bag of knitted hats on the porch with a note that said, "For those who forgot what warmth feels like." The local bakery offered bread. The owner of a hardware store sent extra chairs. It felt like the valley itself had been waiting for someone to ask. That afternoon, a small SUV pulled up outside the lodge. A young woman stepped out, cheeks flushed from the cold brown hair tucked under a beanie. "Emily Carter," she called. "That's me," I said, brushing snow off my gloves. "I'm Sarah Nguyen. I'm a nurse at Aspen Valley Hospital. Heard about what you're doing." She held up a clipboard. "I figured you could use an extra set of hands, and maybe a thermometer or two." Inside the kitchen buzzed with movement. Sarah unpacked her bag. Sanitizer gloves, instant thermometers. We checked oven temperatures, measured fridge cooling levels, made a list of perishables. She moved quickly, confident, humming Christmas songs under her breath. When I asked her why she came, she shrugged. "I've worked too many holidays in ERs. It's nice to help people when they're still smiling." We spent the rest of the day planning. The grocery supplier promised 10 turkeys. The food bank would donate produce. Sarah handled the medical safety forms, while I called my old friend Diane Monroe. She picked up on the second ring. "Well, if it isn't the woman who disappeared into the mountains. How's isolation treating you?" "Busier than you'd think," I said. "Listen, I'm hosting a community dinner. I need to make sure everything's legal. Permits, food distribution, volunteer liability. Can you help?" Diane sighed, then chuckled. "You really don't do small things, do you?" "Fine, I'll email you the forms. Oh, and speaking of legal issues, remember the logistics firm we talked about last year? They're still cooking their numbers. If you ever get the urge to make a difference again, I could use some data." I looked out the window at the snow, the world quiet, except for the creak of pine trees in the wind. "Send me what you've got. I'll handle the rest. Still the same." "Emily," she said softly, "just don't forget to rest once in a while." After we hung up, I went back to the kitchen. Sarah had started testing recipes, cranberry glaze bubbling on the stove, the air filled with cinnamon and cloves. She handed me a spoon. "Taste this." I did. It was too sweet, but the warmth hit deep. "Good," I said. "We'll make 3 gallons of it." Over the next 2 days, the lodge transformed. Tables were carried in from the barn, polished until they gleamed. Local kids strung garlands of dried oranges and pine cones. Volunteers lit fires in the stone hearth, laughter echoing off the beams. Every morning I'd step outside to breathe in the cold and watch the smoke curl from the chimney. The sound of work filled the valley. Saws, voices, the occasional burst of country music from a radio. At night, I'd collapse into bed with my notebook open beside me, lists scrawled in black ink chairs, 190 blankets, 85 pies, 36. The day before Christmas Eve, Sheriff Collins dropped by, again snow dusting his hat. He handed me a clipboard. "Here's the final list," he said. "Families from the shelter." A few retirees, some folks passing through town. Oh, and one more name at the bottom. I read it aloud. "Frank Dalton, 70. Lives alone outside town. Old veteran," Collins said. "Lost his wife a while back. Doesn't talk much." I nodded, circling his name. "He'll sit in the first chair." That night the lodge glowed like a lantern in the snow. The air hummed with quiet anticipation, the kind that lives in your chest before something good happens. I stood outside, snow falling soft on my coat, and looked at the lights reflecting on the windows. Inside, people moved like shadows, setting tables, laughing, carrying food. For the first time, the building didn't feel empty. Beneath the vast sky of the Rockies, I thought about all the years I'd spent waiting for someone to make room for me. 4 days of planning, a lifetime of preparation. I smiled and whispered into the cold. This is what it was all for. The kitchen smelled like butter and cinnamon, thick and sweet enough to make the air feel warm. Snow pressed against the windows, heavy and relentless, blurring the pine trees outside. Sarah was kneading dough at the counter flower, streaking her sleeves. The ovens hummed, 2 of them, full of roasting turkeys that crackled softly, skin turning gold. My phone buzzed beside the cutting board. I glanced at the screen. Ethan. For a moment I considered letting it ring out, then I wiped my hands on a towel and answered. Hey. I said. Hey, he replied, voice hesitant. You busy? Only if baking counts. He hesitated again. Grace is hosting a reunion tonight. Mom said it's just family. I felt something in me flinch, a small reflex that came from years of hearing those same words dressed up in new excuses. I steadied my breath. I know. You don't deserve this, he said quietly. You've done so much. I thought they won't. I cut in, not angry, just certain. Maybe I do deserve it. Or maybe I'll redefine what I deserve. Ethan sighed. You always sound like you're okay. But are you? I smiled faintly, though he couldn't see it. I stopped waiting for, okay, it's overrated. Outside, the wind picked up snow swirling in sudden gusts that rattled the window panes. I watched the flakes stick to the glass and melt instantly, leaving tiny trails of water. I wish you were here, he said. I'm here, I answered softly. Just not there. He didn't reply for a few seconds. They'll regret it one day, maybe I said, or maybe they won't, but I'll still be fine. When the call ended, I stood still for a moment, listening to the quiet rhythm of the kitchen. The clatter of pans, the muffled hum of the heaters. Sarah's low humming as she worked. I used to think forgiveness meant weakness, that letting go made you small. But standing there with snow piling up outside and a house full of warmth, I realized the truth. Forgiveness isn't surrender. It's survival. It's how you keep from turning into the same cold that once hurt you. The memory came suddenly, as memories often do, not as a story, but as a smell, a sound, a flash of light. Portland Christmas, Gonarder 2018. The music from inside the church spilled out into the snow, faint and warm, while I sat on the front steps holding a paper cup of cocoa that had already gone cold. Through the open doors, I could see them, my father standing at the altar, his hand resting on Grace's shoulder, laughter echoing as he gave her away. The crowd clapped, someone whistled, and I sat there, snow landing in my hair, my throat too tight to swallow. I didn't cry. I just watched, waiting for someone to notice I wasn't inside. No one did. The wind outside the lodge howled, pulling me back to the present. I exhaled slowly and reached for my laptop. The cursor blinked in the empty email window like a small heartbeat. To Aspen Valley Church, Haven Shelter. Mountain View Diner. Subject: Christmas Eve dinner. Open invitation. Body: we have space and food for anyone who needs a warm meal this year. No reservations, no requirements. Just come. I hit send before I could second guess it. Then another email. To the sheriff's office, to the community radio station, to every contact Tom Parker had given me. When I closed the laptop, Sarah was watching me from the counter. You just invited half of Aspen, didn't you? Hopefully more than half, I said. She grinned. You realize you're outnumbered. That's the plan. We worked until our backs ached, and the kitchen looked like a small battlefield of flour and heat. Sarah left just before dark, promising to return at sunrise. I stood by the window as her taillights disappeared down the snowy road. The wind roared again, stronger this time, whistling through the eaves. I turned off the last light in the kitchen, leaving only the fire burning in the stone hearth. Its glow painted the room in shades of amber and gold. I walked to the window, leaned my forehead against the cool glass, and watched the storm gather. Snow swept across the porch, thickening by the minute. For a second, I imagined my family's house in Portland. The way light used to spill from the dining room windows, the laughter, the toasts, the camera flashes. It didn't hurt the way it used to. It just felt distant, like a life I'd already outgrown. No one can exclude you from Christmas unless you let them. I whispered the words aloud, watching them fog the glass. The fire behind me cracked softly, and for the first time that night, I let myself feel something close to peace. The kind that doesn't come from being invited, but from finally realizing you don't need to be. I turned away from the window, checked the ovens one last time, then walked through the great hall. The garlands Sarah had hung swayed gently from the rafters, their scent of pine and oranges faint in the warm air. Tomorrow this room would be full. Voices, laughter, strangers who wouldn't feel like strangers for long. I ran my hand along the back of the first chair, the one nearest the fire, and thought of the old man's name on the list. Frank Dalton, 70, lives alone. Your seat's waiting, I murmured. Then I blew out the last candle, letting the shadows settle back into place. The snow kept falling outside fast and endless, but inside everything glowed. By the time the first headlights cut through the snow, the world outside had turned to gold. The lodge glowed from within the windows, spilling light across the drifts like a beacon. Inside, the smell of cinnamon roasted turkey and baked bread filled the air. The long tables stretched across the great hall, each one draped with burlap runners and lined with flickering candles. I stood near the doorway, smoothing the edge of my apron, my hands trembling just enough to feel alive. Sarah was the first to spot them, shadows moving through the snow, slow and cautious. She opened the door, and a gust of wind swept in, carrying with it the smell of pine and cold air. An older man stepped through first, his boots heavy, his breath visible. He wore a frayed army jacket, and his face was weathered in that way that only mountain winters and hard years can carve. "Evening," he said quietly. "Someone told me there was dinner here." "There is," I said, stepping forward and offering my hand. "Dinner's warm. Seats ready." His grip was rough but steady. He smiled a little shy. "Name's Frank Dalton." "I know," I said. "We saved you the first chair by the fire." He nodded, eyes glinting in the light. "Appreciate it, ma'am. Been a while since anyone saved me a seat." Sarah took his coat while I led him to the table. For a moment, he just stood there looking at the plates, the candles, the people beginning to gather. "Haven't seen a place look like this since '09, he murmured. "Feels good." "Then you're right where you should be," I said. After Frank, the others came in waves. A pair of nurses still in scrubs, faces flushed from long shifts. A family of 4 whose car had broken down just outside of town. A long-haul trucker with salt in his beard and exhaustion in his eyes. A young woman carrying a sleeping toddler. Each time the door opened, the cold tried to follow, but it never stood a chance. "Hot cider." "By the stove," Sarah called out, each time smiling so wide it looked like she'd been doing this her whole life. I moved through the room, checking on every detail. Platters of food, steaming cups, refilled kids, finding spots near the fireplace. Laughter began to replace the quiet, like warmth expanding through the walls. Someone started humming Silent Night. Someone else joined in. For a second, I stepped back, taking it all in. 200 seats, every one of them filled. The hum of voices rose and fell like the steady rhythm of a heart finally beating after too long. On the far table, a boy, no older than 12, held a phone, awkwardly taking pictures of the food, of the people of the room, glowing under string lights. I caught his eye and smiled. He grinned back, then pointed his camera toward the fireplace where Frank was sitting, hands wrapped around a mug of cider. Frank glanced up at me, eyes glistening. 10 years, he said softly. I stepped closer. 10 years. Since I had someone to say Merry Christmas to, he said. His voice cracked barely a whisper over the noise. I didn't hesitate. "Well," I said, placing a hand on his shoulder, "tonight you do." For a moment, everything else seemed to pause. The music, the laughter, even the fire. He smiled, a small, fragile thing, and nodded. "Then Merry Christmas, ma'am." "Merry Christmas, Frank." The boy snapped a photo. Just then, the flash catching both our faces in the glow of the hearth. I didn't think much of it at the time. Across the hall, Sarah clinked her glass. "To kindness," she said, and the crowd echoed her. "To kindness." Outside, snow kept falling, but inside, it was spring. I walked to the window for a breath of air, brushing flour off my sleeve. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A notification. I pulled it out, half distracted, and saw Grace's name on the screen. She'd posted a photo, a long table, set with china and silver crystal glasses glittering. Her caption read, "Family only." The words sat heavy for a moment. I looked at the picture. Perfect lighting, matching sweaters, the same proud smile Dad always wore when he looked at her. Then I turned the phone face down on the windowsill. Behind me, laughter burst again. Sarah dropping a spoon, a child squealing, someone calling out for seconds. I smiled and went back to the kitchen. As the night went on, the hall grew louder. Someone brought out a guitar. The nurses clapped along. A toddler fell asleep on a pile of coats. I moved from table to table, filling cups, clearing plates, touching shoulders. The faces blurred together, but the feeling didn't. I wasn't thinking about who had left me out anymore. I was thinking about everyone who had walked in. At one point, I caught sight of Frank again, laughing now, telling a story to the boy with the phone. The firelight made him look younger. The boy snapped another picture, and for a second the flash caught me standing behind them watching. Sometimes justice doesn't need a courtroom or a speech. It doesn't even need words. Sometimes all it takes is a camera catching the truth, that goodness still exists quietly, stubbornly, in places the world forgot to look. By midnight, the tables were a beautiful mess. Crumbs. Empty plates, cider stains, paper napkins, folded into little boats by restless hands. I stood at the center of the room, surrounded by the hum of soft conversation and the crackle of firewood. The wind outside howled against the walls, but it couldn't get in. Not tonight. I looked around at faces I'd never seen before and might never see again, and felt something I hadn't felt in years, complete. For the first time, I wasn't cold. The morning after the dinner was almost too quiet. The snow outside had thickened overnight, burying the porch steps, softening every edge of the world. Inside, the air still smelled of butter and smoke, of something warm that refused to fade. The long tables were littered with crumbs and empty mugs, half-burnt candles, standing like memories. I padded into the kitchen in wool socks, started a pot of coffee, and stood by the window watching the sun lift over the mountains. The light hit the snow just right, blinding and pure, like the valley was wrapped in glass. When the coffee finished brewing, I poured a cup and reached for my phone. I hadn't checked it since last night. The screen lit up instantly, a flood of notifications climbing over each other. Mentions, messages, missed calls. At first, I thought something was wrong. Then I saw the headline, "The Woman Who Saved Christmas." Below it was a photograph. Me standing beside Frank in front of the fire, both of us smiling under the glow of the lights. Someone had posted it with the caption, "This is what Christmas should be." The article was written by Mark Evans, a journalist I vaguely remembered meeting years ago at a logistics conference. He must have found the photos that had spread overnight. The piece was short, written with that kind of quiet awe reporters save for miracles they didn't expect to find. He wrote about the dinner, about 200 strangers finding warmth in a snowstorm, about how my $5 million lodge in Aspen had become a symbol of inclusion. I scrolled, my hands trembling. Every post was the same, pictures of smiling faces, candles, snow falling through the windows, #FreeForAll, #AspenMiracle, #WhatFamilyMeans. This is what Christmas should be. She did what families forgot to. Faith in humanity restored. I sank into the chair by the fireplace, coffee trembling in my hand. I didn't cry. I didn't laugh. I just stared at the screen, unable to believe how fast a small act could ripple through the world. Outside, the wind brushed snow off the pines, scattering it like confetti. In Portland, 4 states away, the same photo was playing on the morning news. I found that out later. Dad watching from the living room, the TV reflecting in his glasses. The anchor's voice bright and cheerful. Her Aspen Lodge has become a national story of generosity. What began as a dinner for locals turned into a symbol of belonging. I could picture it perfectly. Mom sitting beside him, lips pressed tight. Grace scrolling through her phone, pretending not to care. Then the camera panned to my face, the same one they hadn't looked at in years, now filling their television. Dad's call came a few minutes later. I answered before the second ring. "Do you realize what you've done?" His voice was sharp, clipped, the kind of anger that hides behind control. "Everyone's talking about us. The neighbors, the church, the paper. They all think we excluded you. You embarrassed this family." I took a sip of coffee, looking out the window at the valley blanketed in white. "No, Dad," I said quietly. I reminded them what family means. He sputtered as if trying to find the right words, then hung up without another sound. The silence that followed was familiar, but it didn't hurt this time. It felt like proof. A few minutes later, Sarah appeared in the doorway, her hair messy from sleep, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. "Morning," she said, yawning. "You're up early. Couldn't sleep." She poured herself a cup and noticed the phone in my hand. "You've seen it, huh?" I nodded. She smiled, sitting across from me. "You realize what you started." I shook my head. "I didn't start anything. I just opened the door." We drank in silence for a moment. The fire crackled softly. Outside, sunlight spilled through the trees. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a message. Mark Evans. You've started something, Emily. People across the country are planning to open their doors next year. They're calling it the Open Hearth Movement. Thought you'd like to know. I read it twice, the words almost too big to fit inside me. I set the phone down, walked to the window, and pressed my palm against the cold glass. The world beyond looked endless, unspoiled. Smoke curled from a nearby chimney, rising straight into the blue sky. Somewhere a bird sang, a sound I hadn't heard in days. I thought of Frank's laugh, of the little boy's camera, of every stranger who had walked through my door and left a little lighter. I thought of my father's voice, tight with pride, disguised as shame. I didn't need to argue. I didn't need to prove. I didn't need to shout for anyone to hear me anymore. I just needed to let them see. Sarah joined me at the window. What now? She asked softly. I smiled. Now we rest. Then we do it again next year. She nodded, eyes bright, then went to start cleaning up the tables. I stayed by the window a little longer, watching the sun climb higher over the Rockies. The snow sparkled like glass dust. For the first time, the quiet didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like the pause before something larger, something that didn't need my permission to exist. I took a slow sip of coffee, closed my eyes, and breathed in the scent of it all. The pine, the wood smoke, the proof that kindness could echo farther than cruelty ever did. When I opened my eyes again, I whispered, "Perfect." By New Year's week, the snow had turned to glass. The valley gleamed under a sun so bright it hurt to look at, and every news channel, every magazine headline seemed to have found its way to Aspen. They called it the Aspen Christmas Miracle. I'd seen the phrase enough times that it had started to lose meaning, until I realized what they were really talking about wasn't me. It was what had happened when people remembered each other, but not everyone liked the reflection it cast. Grace's photo was the first thing I saw that morning. A still frame from a video of her speaking at a philanthropy luncheon in Seattle, all dressed in cream and pearls. Behind her, projected on the wall, was an image of me at the lodge, laughing with Frank by the fire. My name glowed in the caption, Aspen Lodge's Emily Carter. She'd used my image to talk about family values and giving back. The clip made it online within hours. Comments filled every platform. Family only, huh? Isn't this the same sister she left out? Nice speech. Grace, maybe try honesty next time. By evening, her PR firm had gone silent, and a reporter on a Seattle station used the word irony 3 times in one segment. In Portland, Dad's firm had a different kind of trouble. The company he'd consulted for announced it was parting ways due to recent reputational concerns. By morning, his name was gone from the firm's website, the partners unable to comment. And Mom, dear careful Mom, had shut down her social media entirely after a local paper ran a story about the daughter left out in the cold. I imagined her in the living room, curtains drawn, phone off, holding one of our old family photos, like it could somehow bring the world back to how it was. I didn't take pleasure in any of it. Watching someone's mask fall off isn't satisfying. It's just quiet. Karma doesn't need anger. It just needs light, bright enough to show what's always been there. The lodge was silent that afternoon, only the crackle of the fire filling the hall. I sat on the porch steps, bundled in a blanket, watching flakes drift through the air. The wind cut sharp against my face, but I didn't move. I was reading a letter that had come in the mail, the handwriting so familiar, I smiled before I even opened it. It was from Diane Monroe. Emily, we won. The case closed yesterday. The court ruled in favor of the hospitals, and the logistics firm's been fined for falsifying medical transport data. Your information gave us what we needed. You didn't just expose them. You saved lives. Happy New Year, my friend. I read it twice, the words fogging slightly where my breath touched the paper. Saved lives. I let the phrase sit in the quiet. The idea that something I'd built from scraps, something once born from loneliness, had reached beyond me. A gust of wind carried snow off the roof, scattering it in silver dust across the porch. I tucked the letter into my coat pocket and leaned back against the railing. The world was finally loud about something worth hearing. A few days later, Mark Evans showed up with his camera crew. He was exactly as I remembered him. Tall, deliberate, the kind of man who thought before every word. Emily, he said, shaking my hand, you've started a national conversation. People are calling you the heart of Christmas. I laughed. Let's hope they don't start selling ornaments with my face. He smiled. Mind if we do a quick interview? Just a few questions. We sat near the fire, the same one that had burned through that long night. He adjusted his mic, nodded to the cameraman, and began. You've inspired something bigger than you probably imagined. When you look back, what do you think made this moment possible? I thought for a second. I guess, being told there wasn't room for me. He nodded slowly. And if your family's watching this interview, what would you tell them? The fire popped once, sharp and small. I looked straight into the camera. Merry Christmas, I said softly. And thank you for teaching me what not to be. Mark didn't speak for a moment. Then he lowered his eyes and smiled faintly. That's going to resonate, he said. When the crew left, I walked them to the porch, snow crunching beneath our boots. The air smelled clean like cedar and frost. As they drove off, the sound of tires fading into the valley, I turned back to the lodge. Smoke rose from the chimney, curling into the blue-gray sky. I stood there a while, listening to nothing but wind and wood. The silence used to be a prison. Tight, heavy, filled with everything unsaid. Now it was peace. It was the sound of a story that no longer needed permission to be told. I looked up at the snow gathering on the roof, the mountains stretching endless behind it, and thought maybe this was all I ever needed. Not their applause, not their seat at the table. Just the stillness that comes when you finally stop asking to be understood. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of firewood and sugar. Somewhere behind me, the kettle whistled. I smiled, stepped inside, and closed the door on the storm. The letter came on the first clear day of January. The snow had begun to melt, dripping off the lodge roof in slow, rhythmic beats. It was tucked in with the morning mail, a pale blue envelope, my name written in the familiar cursive that always leaned a little too far to the right. I knew who it was from before I touched it. Inside there were only 6 words. We'd like to see you. Mom, no apologies, no explanations, just a sentence suspended between guilt and hope. A week later, their car appeared at the edge of the drive, a black SUV cutting through the last of the snow. I'd known they would come the same way you know a storm is over by the sound of birds returning. Still, when I saw them step out, it didn't feel like victory. It just felt quiet. Mom was the first to move. She hurried up the porch steps, breathless, her gloved hands reaching for me. Emily, she said, voice trembling, we forgot what Christmas means. I let her hug me. She smelled like the same perfume she'd always worn, rose and winter air. When she pulled back, her eyes were red but steady. Dad lingered behind her, his shoulders squared, his expression caught between pride and shame. He looked older than I remembered, the lines around his mouth deeper, his confidence deflated. You've done something big, he said finally. You made us look human. I met his gaze. That's all I ever wanted. He nodded once, as if that truth hit harder than he expected. I stepped aside, holding the door open. Come in. The warmth from the fireplace reached them first. Mom paused in the doorway, her eyes scanning the main hall, the garlands still hanging the tables stacked neatly to one side, and above the fireplace, the wooden sign that read, "For the one left out in the cold." She stared at it for a long time. You kept it up, I did, I said. It belongs here. They walked slowly through the space, taking in the remnants of a night they hadn't seen, but the world had witnessed for them. Dad stopped near the fire, rubbing his hands together, though he wasn't cold. You built this place yourself. With a little help, I said. A few strangers, a few friends. Mom traced her hand along the edge of a chair, her voice barely audible. I saw the videos. People smiling, singing. That veteran who said you gave him a reason to celebrate again. She stopped, exhaling. I didn't think anyone could do that without a family. Neither did I said. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, just heavy with things none of us could undo. Then she turned to me. I'm sorry, Em. We thought you were fine. I smiled faintly. I was just not because of you. Her eyes filled again, but she didn't look away. I think that was the first honest moment we'd shared in years. The front door creaked open behind us, letting in a rush of cold air. Grace stood there holding her daughter's hand. Lily's cheeks were flushed pink from the drive, her curls peeking out under a knit hat. For a second, the sight of them both pulled me back to birthdays and dinners, and the years I'd spent orbiting Grace's glow. Hi, she said quietly. Hi. She glanced around, then at me. You really did it, didn't you? I guess I did. Lily wriggled free and ran toward me before Grace could stop her. She threw her arms around my waist. Aunt Em. I saw the pictures. Your Christmas was prettier. I knelt to her level, brushing a strand of hair from her face, because everyone was invited. I said, she grinned, showing the small gap where her front tooth used to be, "Can we come next year too?" I laughed softly. "If you help bake the pies." Grace smiled then, small, uncertain, but real. For once, it didn't feel like competition. It just felt like acknowledgement. We all ended up in the great hall gathered near the hearth as the fire crackled. No one said much. Words would have ruined it. Dad took off his gloves, staring out the window where the last snow clung to the pine branches. Mom sat beside him, hands clasped tight. Grace leaned against the wall, arms folded, her face unreadable. I poured coffee for everyone. It felt strange, this role reversal. Me serving them not out of duty, but out of choice. When I handed Dad his cup, he hesitated before taking it. "You've built something good here," he said quietly. "Something we couldn't have." "I built what I needed, I said. He nodded, eyes fixed on the snow outside. "Maybe that's what we should have let you do sooner." No one answered. The fire popped again, scattering sparks up the chimney. In that silence, I realized I wasn't angry anymore. Whatever resentment had once filled me had melted the way snow turns to water when it's had enough of pretending to be something harder than it is. Forgiveness doesn't need an apology. It only needs you to stop carrying the weight. When they left later that afternoon, the sun was just beginning to set behind the peaks. The snowmelt glittered on the steps as Dad helped Mom into the car. Grace buckled Lily into the back seat. Mom rolled down the window, her hand brushing the air. "We'll call soon," she said. "I know." Dad looked up at the lodge one last time. His eyes met mine, and he gave a small nod. Not of approval, not of surrender, but of understanding. Then he turned toward the road. I stood on the porch long after their taillights disappeared into the trees. The air was crisp, filled with that faint scent of pine and smoke. Somewhere nearby, a branch cracked under the weight of melting snow. I closed my eyes and let the quiet settle in. The storm had passed, and for the first time, silence didn't feel like distance. It felt like peace. The first morning of the new year came soft and pale, the kind of winter quiet that felt like the world holding its breath. The snow had thinned overnight, leaving only a thin white film across the porch railings and the tops of the pines. The sky, above Aspen, glowed faint gold as the sun climbed over the ridge. I sat on the porch, wrapped in a wool sweater, hands curled around a mug of coffee that steamed into the cold. The smell of roasted beans mixed with pine and wood smoke. My laptop rested on the small table beside me, the screen glowing against the morning light. An unread email blinked in the corner. It was from Mark Evans. Subject, Aspen Lodge to host annual open hearth Christmas. I opened it slowly. "Emily," it read. "Thought you'd want to know. The idea's gone national. Dozens of towns are hosting their own open dinners next year. Volunteers are calling it the Open Hearth Movement. People say you started something real. Hope to be there again next Christmas." I stared at the words, letting them sink in one at a time. The sunlight caught on the steam of my coffee, and for a moment, everything felt suspended. Time breath memory. I smiled, not wide, just enough to feel it reach my eyes. Dad used to say Christmas was for family. He was right. He just never imagined how big that word could get. Inside the lodge, the fire still burned low in the hearth. I walked back in bare feet, pressing against the old wooden floors that now creaked in a familiar rhythm. On the walls hung the photographs people had sent me in the past few weeks, faces I barely knew. All smiling around tables that looked just like ours had. A church hall in Kansas, a diner in Vermont, a barn in Montana. Each photo stamped with the same handwritten words, "Everyone's welcome." I paused at one sent by Sarah, a selfie of her surrounded by hospital staff trays of food in the background, patients sitting up in bed, smiling. Beneath it, she'd written, "We brought the lodge spirit to the ward this year." Another came from Frank. It was a blurry picture of a community center, veterans and families eating under strings of colored lights. He'd added, "Told them about the seat you saved. They saved one too." I laughed softly. The sound echoed in the empty room, not lonely anymore, but alive. The hashtag #FreeForAll had turned into something bigger than a trend. It had become a message whispered from one door to another until it became a chorus. People weren't waiting to be invited anymore. They were building their own tables. I moved slowly through the lodge, brushing my fingers across the chairs. The garlands the long table polished smooth by so many hands. On the sideboard were stacks of letters from strangers. Thank you stories, photos of dinners in places I'd never been. Some were written in careful cursive, others in block print by children. One line stood out in a note from a woman in Ohio. You made me believe the world still has room for me. I folded the letter carefully, placed it back on the pile, and stood still for a while. The silence in the room felt different now. Not the emptiness of before, but the kind of quiet that means something's begun. I stepped outside again. The snow crunched under my boots, fresh air biting my cheeks. The valley spread wide beneath me, the peaks catching fire from the sunrise. For a moment, I felt like I could see forever. Every house, every light, every open door that had followed ours. I walked to the end of the porch, where the old wooden sign still hung on its chain. The words carved into it had started to fade from the weather, but they were still legible. For everyone left out in the cold. I laid my hand on the wood, tracing the grooves with my fingertips. When they closed their doors, I learned how to open mine. When they went silent, I learned how to make noise out of kindness. And now I know, I was never really alone. The wind picked up, gently sweeping snow across the steps. I turned back toward the lodge, the windows glowing gold against the morning. From inside, the faint sound of the fire cracked, followed by the distant chime of my phone as more messages arrived. I took a deep breath, letting the cold fill my lungs, then exhaled slowly. If you've ever been left out of a table, remember, somewhere a door is already open for you. You just have to walk through it. The sun rose higher, spilling light across the roof, and the lodge stood steady beneath it, wrapped in warmth against the endless white. Inside, the fire burned brighter. Outside, the world kept getting wider. And for the first time, it truly felt like home.